A snowbound mountain house, the American West, dead of night. Nell laid her marriage contract on the table. Then the first man pulled out his. The second, the third. 3 contracts, 1 signature. Hers. I didn't sign 3. Outside a gunshot. Rowan filled her coffee cup first, then looked up. What do you expect from us? Nell slid a handwritten page across the table. All 3 men signed it. No argument, no conditions. She hadn't prepared for that. She came west as a transaction. In one night, she rewrote every term. Watch to find out what happens next. The stagecoach hit the ice at the worst possible angle. Nell felt the wheels go sideways before anyone had time to shout. Then came the long, slow tilt, the kind that gives you just enough time to understand what's about to happen, but not enough to stop it. She grabbed the door frame. The world rolled. Wood splintered. A horse screamed somewhere behind the curtain of white. When it stopped, she was on her side in the dark, pressed against what used to be the floor. Cold air poured through a crack in the door above her head. She climbed out through that crack, dragging her suitcase behind her. The driver was on the ground, leg pinned under the coach's running board. He was breathing. She could see that much. She checked his pulse, checked his skull for blood, and told him to stay still. He didn't argue. His face was the color of old ash. That was when she heard the horses, not the downed ones, different horses. Somewhere back in the storm, hooves were moving steady and deliberate through the snow. Riders, coming closer. Nell stood up. Uphill, through 300 yards of blowing white, a light burned above a dark structure. 3 separate flames in a single lantern, stacked like a signal. She didn't know what the signal meant. She only knew it was there, and the riders weren't. She lifted her traveling dress above the snow, picked up her suitcase, and started walking. She found the barn before she found the house. The structure loomed up out of the dark, and she went toward the warmth the same way freezing people always do, without thinking, without planning, just moving toward the heat. She pushed the heavy door open. The smell hit her first. Straw, livestock, lantern oil, and something else. Panic. Animals carry it the same as people do. 3 men were in the middle of the barn floor, crouched around a cow that was down on her side. One of them was holding the animal's head, keeping her still by sheer force and calm. The second was on his knees in the straw, with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, frowning at something Nell couldn't see from the doorway. The third was at the wood stove in the corner, heating water and folding clean blankets. They didn't hear her come in. She saw what was wrong before any of them noticed she was there. The calf wasn't positioned right. She could see it in the way the cow was straining, in the angle of the second man's arm, in the helpless tension in all 3 of their bodies. They were pulling. That was exactly the wrong thing to do. Stop, she said. All 3 heads turned. She was already moving. She set her suitcase down against the wall, crossed the barn floor, and knelt beside the second man without asking permission. You're pulling against a malpresentation, she said. You keep that up, you'll lose them both. The man kneeling beside her, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of stillness that meant he was deciding. Something fast, looked at her hands and then at her face. Who in the hell are you? Someone who knows what she's looking at. Move, he moved. The man holding the cow's head hadn't said anything. He just shifted his weight so Nell had room to work, and when she told him to keep the animal calm, he did exactly that. No argument, no question. He simply did the job she asked. Nell worked. Her hands found the calf's position, made the small, careful corrections that couldn't be forced. She talked the whole time, not to the men, but out loud, the same way her mentor had taught her, narrating what she was doing so. Her own mind stayed clear. The cow shuddered. The third man, the one who'd been at the stove, brought a warmed blanket and set it next to Nell's knee without her asking. She noticed that. She filed it away. 15 minutes later, the calf was out. It didn't breathe. Nell cleared its airway with 2 fingers, rubbed its ribs with the flat of her palm, and tilted it forward. The man from the stove knelt beside her and helped her wrap the blanket around it. his hands following her movements without fumbling. The sharp-eyed man watched from 2 feet away, not hovering, just ready. The quiet one who'd held the cow was already checking the mother, his voice low and steady near her ear. The calf took a breath. It was weak, more of a shudder than a breath, really, but it counted. Nell sat back on her heels, and the relief hit her so hard, her eyes stung. She blinked it back, pressed her knuckles against her mouth. She'd done this before. She knew how it felt when a life you'd been pulling toward the world finally decided to stay. She also knew what it felt like to believe you'd never hold one of your own. She said it before she could stop herself. "I was told I can't have children." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. A physician declared it, formally. She looked at the calf, still shivering in its blanket. "So this is probably the closest I'll ever get." The quiet man, the one who'd held the cow steady through the whole ordeal, stood up slowly. He was broad-shouldered, with dark hair, going silver at the temples, and the kind of deliberate way of moving that suggested he'd spent a long time in places where fast movements caused problems. He crossed to where she was kneeling, bent down close enough that she could hear him clearly, over the wind battering the barn walls, and said, "I'll show you how to make babies." Nell went very still. She turned to look at him. Every part of her had already assembled an answer, sharp, cold, the kind of refusal that lets a man know exactly how far across a line he has stepped. But he was already reaching down. He lifted the calf carefully from the straw and placed it in her arms. The animal was damp and trembling and small, and it weighed almost nothing. "Bringing one into the world," he said. "That's only the beginning. Keeping it warm after."
Fed, protected,
Loved. He straightened up. "That's the part that makes a life." Nell looked down at the calf in her arms. She didn't have anything to say to that. The sharp-eyed man was already preparing a bottle with the mother's first milk. The one from the stove was building up a warm nest beside the wood stove with hay and a folded blanket. Nobody asked her to hand the calf over. They just worked around her. She held it until it stopped shaking. The house was warm. Someone put dry clothing outside the washroom door and didn't knock to tell her. It was there. She changed out of her soaked traveling dress and found a kitchen with a fire going, and 3 men who introduced themselves the way people do when they've already decided to trust you and are only going through the formality for courtesy's sake. Rowan Mercer, the quiet one. Silas Mercer, the sharp-eyed one. Jonah Mercer, the one from the stove. Nell introduced herself and placed the letter on the table. Her marriage contract, with her signature at the bottom, arranging her passage to Mercer Pass as a mail-order bride. Rowan Mercer's name was at the top. Silas reached into his coat and put a second contract on the table. His name was at the top. Her signature was at the bottom. Jonah said a third one beside it without a word. The 3 of them looked at the papers, then at her. "I didn't sign 3 contracts," Nell said. "No," Rowan said. "I expect you didn't." Silas picked up all 3 and held them together against the lantern light. "Same signature," he said. "Same seal, different dates." A gunshot cracked somewhere below the house. Then another. The barn door opened and the stagecoach driver stumbled in through the back entrance, one hand pressed to his side, his face worse than it had been when she'd left him. He looked at Nell. "They're looking for you," he said. "Specifically you." The sound that followed wasn't a gunshot. It was lower, a rolling, grinding thunder that shook dust from the ceiling beams and went on for 10 full seconds before the night went quiet again. Rowan moved to the window, looked out toward the lower trail. "Avalanche," he said. "Road's gone." Nell stood in the kitchen of a house that belonged to 3 men she'd met an hour ago, all 3 of whom held a contract claiming she was his bride, with armed riders somewhere below in the dark, and no way out of the mountain until the snow cleared. She thought about the 3 identical signatures. She thought about the seal on all 3 contracts, the same symbol she'd seen before. On papers she was never supposed to have read, she didn't mention that yet. In the washroom, while the men were talking, she had found the hem of her traveling dress. The secret stitching was cut clean. Someone had opened it before she ever boarded the stagecoach. The page she'd hidden there was gone. Nell put all 3 contracts on the breakfast table before anyone had poured their coffee. She set them side by side, edges lined up, and then she sat down, looked at the 3 men across from her, and waited. Rowan looked at the contracts, then at her. He reached for the coffee pot and filled her cup first. "What do you expect from me?" she asked. "All 3 of you." "I want to hear it said out loud." Silas leaned back in his chair. "I want to know why armed men followed you up a mountain in a blizzard." "That's not what I asked. It's what I need to know before anything else matters." Jonah set down his cup. "Are you hurt anywhere? From the crash? Or before it? Do you need medicine?" It wasn't quite a question. More like he was taking inventory and wanted to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Rowan was the last to speak. He looked at the contracts for a moment, then pushed them toward her side of the table. "You're a guest, not a wife. Not until you choose to be, and not to any man who didn't earn it." Nell looked at all 3 of them. She'd prepared for negotiation. She hadn't prepared for this. She laid out her conditions anyway, because prepared or not, she wasn't leaving them unstated. No one entered her room without permission. No contract could be used to demand marriage or anything that came with it. No one made decisions in her name, and her labor, anything she contributed to this household, would be treated as work, not as payment for the roof over her head. She slid the paper across the table with the conditions written out in her own hand. Rowan read it, signed it, and passed it left. Silas read it twice. Then he signed it. Jonah signed it without reading it, which made Nell narrow her eyes at him until he looked up and said, "I already agreed with all of it before you wrote it down." She took the paper back and folded it into her dress pocket. The mare was off her feed by mid-morning. Nell noticed it while she was returning the newborn calf's blanket to the barn. The animal was standing apart from the others, head low, and when Nell offered her a handful of oats from the bin, she turned away. Silas was checking the water barrels when Nell came to find him. "One of your mares is sick," she said, "refusing water and feed both." He followed her back to the stall, looked the horse over, and his expression went careful. "Could be contagious. If it is, I need to pull all of them out of this barn and into the south paddock before it moves through the herd." "Before you do that," Nell said, "let me look at the water." "The water's fine." "You don't know that yet." He opened his mouth, closed it, stepped aside. Nell checked the storage barrels one by one. The third one had a smell to it, faint but wrong. And when she got the lantern close enough to look inside, she found the source. Something small had gone into the water and died there. A rat, most likely, or a weasel. Long enough ago that the contamination had spread through a full barrel. "This one," she said. "Dump it and scrub it out. Don't let any of them drink from it until you've done that." Silas stood beside her with the lantern, looking into the barrel. "If you'd quarantined the whole herd," Nell said, not making a point of it, just stating it plainly, "you'd have lost a week of work and probably never found this." "I know," he said. He didn't offer excuses. He just picked up the barrel and started for the door. She appreciated that more than she expected to. Jonah taught her how to feed the calf that afternoon. The animal was steadier on its legs now, bumping its nose against Nell's palm when she wasn't moving fast enough with the bottle. Jonah stood beside her and adjusted the angle of her wrist so the calf wouldn't pull in air with the milk. "He thinks he's starving," Jonah said. "He's not. He just doesn't know that yet." "He reminds me of Silas," Nell said. Jonah looked at her for a moment and then laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that came from somewhere real. "Don't tell him that. He'll take it as a compliment, and the calf will never live it down." Nell smiled before she could decide whether she wanted to. Rowan took her to the signal tower before the light went. It was a narrow structure, built into the rock face above the house, with a ladder inside and a lantern housing at the top that could hold 3 separate flames in a vertical line. Each flame had its own shutter. Each shutter had its own pull cord. 3 flames together means all clear. Rowan said. Top flame alone means send help. Middle flame means riders on the road. Bottom flame means shelter needed. He showed her the chord system, how each one worked independently. You can combine them. 4 basic signals become 12 when you start layering. Who reads them? Used to be other way station operators. Some of them still do, he paused. My sister did. Nell looked at him. On the shelf beside the lantern housing, she'd already noticed the papers. A stack of old advertisements, clipped from broadsheets, all from the Western Matrimonial Registry. Some of them were years old, the paper gone yellow at the edges. How long have you been collecting those? She asked. 8 years, Rowan said. Lydia was 19 when she answered one of those advertisements. She went to meet the agent in town, and she didn't come back. Nell turned to look at the advertisements again. She had seen Lydia's name. She was almost certain of it. In the records she'd taken from Wren's office, the ones she was never supposed to have read, there had been an entry with those initials, LM. A transfer notation, a location. She didn't say any of that. She told herself it was because she didn't have the page anymore. She told herself it was because she needed to be sure before she handed that information to men she'd known for less than 24 hours. Both of those things were true. She also knew she was afraid of what it might mean if it was real. Silas found the tracks late in the afternoon. Snowshoe prints above the avalanche line, coming from the direction of the upper ridge and stopping at a point that would have given a clear sightline to the house and barn both. Whoever made them had stood there long enough to pack the snow down beneath their feet. He didn't say anything to the others until he'd followed the trail as far as it went and came back certain. Then he told them at dinner, plain and direct, without building it up. Someone was watching the property today. The warning was nailed to the stable door the following morning. Nell read it before the brothers did. The words identified her as a thief. They accused her, specifically, of stealing a newborn infant from its mother. There was an official-looking seal at the bottom, the same one that appeared on all 3 marriage contracts, and attached to the lower corner with a tack was a tiny leather shoe. Infant-sized, worn soft at the toe from actual use. Rowan pulled the tack out of the wood and held the shoe in his palm for a moment. Silas read the notice a second time, his face unreadable. This was written before whoever posted it knew whether they could get to you, he said. It's not information. It's pressure. I know what it is, Nell said. Then tell us what it's referring to. She looked at the shoe in Rowan's hand, small enough to fit in a coat pocket. Left behind to mean something, to make her feel something. She knew that tactic, too. The agency I traveled through, she said carefully, is connected to more than fraudulent marriages. I worked briefly at a private maternity home. I saw things that didn't add up. I took records that I shouldn't have had, she paused. Someone wants them back, Jonah asked. Did you steal a baby? No. All right, he said. Silas looked at him. That's it? All right? She said, no, Jonah said. What else do you want? Silas turned back to the notice. He didn't argue the point, but Nell could see him filing it, turning it over, looking for the angles. That was simply how his mind worked. She was beginning to understand that it wasn't hostility, it was rigor. He applied it to everything, including himself. The agency arranged Lydia's disappearance, Nell said. She said it quietly. And they arranged mine. I don't think that's a coincidence. Rowan was still holding the shoe. He set it very carefully on the shelf inside the barn door, next to a rusted lantern hook, as if he was putting it somewhere he could find it again. That night, the 3-flame lantern began flashing from the signal tower. Nell was awake when it started. She heard the shutters moving, the pattern repeating, and she went to her window and looked up at the tower and counted the sequence. Top, flame, middle, bottom, pause, top again. None of the brothers were in that tower. She could hear Rowan moving in the room at the end of the hall, pulled awake by the same sound. Below, the kitchen door opened, which meant Silas or Jonah, boots on the porch steps. Someone else was up in that tower, working the cords in the dark, sending a message down the mountain. The strip of blue cloth was thin as a ribbon and tied to the lantern mechanism so that whoever had worked the cords the night before would have seen it clearly. Nell recognized it before Silas finished unwrapping it from the pull cord. "That's an identification band," she said. "From a maternity home." Silas turned it over in his hands. "The specific kind?" "The color means newborn, less than a week old." She took it from him gently and held it up to the light coming through the tower window. "The home I worked at used this exact material. I'd know it anywhere." Silas looked at her for a moment. "Then you need to tell us more about that home," she told them. Not everything, but more than she'd said the night before. The maternity home belonged to a physician named Augustus Wren, reputable on the surface, well-funded, sought out by families who wanted a discreet place for complicated pregnancies. Nell had worked there as an assistant for 4 months before she understood what she was actually seeing. Healthy infants were sometimes recorded as stillborn. Mothers were told their babies hadn't survived. The infants were moved elsewhere. Nell didn't know exactly where. She'd only seen the intake side of it, the records, the bands, the way the numbers didn't match. "I took what I could find," she said. "Pages from a registry he kept. Names, dates, transfer notations. I hid them in the hem of my dress." "And the page from your hem is gone," Silas said. "Yes. How many pages did you take?" "Several. The rest are still hidden." She didn't tell him where. Not yet. Rowan was leaning against the wall near the ladder. He hadn't interrupted once, he said now. "Did any of those records mention Lydia?" Nell didn't answer immediately. "Did they?" he said again. Still quiet. Still controlled. "I saw initials," she said. "LM, I can't be certain it's her. I need to read the page again to be sure, and that page is the one that's missing." The silence in the tower was complete for about 5 seconds. Then Rowan said, "All right," and climbed back down the ladder, and neither of his brothers asked him if he was fine, because clearly he wasn't. The stranded couple arrived before noon. The man came first, half carrying his wife up the path from where their wagon had gotten stuck below the avalanche line. She was heavy with child, and her face told Nell everything, before anyone spoke a word. The labor had already started. Nell cleared the main room in under 3 minutes. She told Rowan what she needed, and he had it before she finished the sentence. Clean water. As hot as they could get it. Sheeting from the storage chest. The lamp moved to give her better light. He positioned the terrified husband near the fire and kept him there with the particular steadiness of someone who understood that panicking men in a birthing room caused more deaths than bad luck did. Silas had done field medicine. He knew how to sterilize without being told, and he went through the available instruments efficiently, asking Nell once which she'd need, and then laying them out in the order she'd use them. Jonah brought blankets and stationed himself where Nell pointed, which was close enough to assist and far enough not to crowd her. The labor moved fast once it started, which was the mercy of it. The cord was wrapped around the infant's neck. Nell felt it before she saw it, and she went still for exactly 1 second, the pause that her mentor had taught her, the one that looks like hesitation but is actually the opposite. "Clear your head, then move." She worked the loop free with 2 careful fingers, a motion that required precision more than speed. And when the baby came the rest of the way, she had him clear and supported before the mother could ask if something was wrong. He was small. His color was off. Nell stimulated his breathing, cleared his airway, rubbed his back with a firm, deliberate pressure. Jonah was already there beside her with a warm cloth, and he followed her hands without waiting to be told, keeping the infant's temperature up while she worked. The baby cried. Small and indignant, but real. The mother made a sound that Nell had heard before and never got used to, the specific relief of a woman who'd been holding her breath for 9 months. Rowan got the father seated before his legs gave out. Silas was already watching Nell's face, reading the situation, and when she signaled him with a look, he moved immediately to help manage what came next, because the mother had started bleeding. and the next 10 minutes required everything she had. They got through it. Both of them, mother and child, breathing steadily in the back room when Nell finally sat down on the bench by the stove and let herself stop moving. That was when it hit her. Not the exhaustion, not the relief. Something older than both of those things. Wren told me my hands would never create life, she said. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. She was just saying it, because sometimes things needed to be said out loud before they lost their power. He said it like he was doing me a kindness, giving me the facts before I wasted any more hope. No one in the room said that Wren was wrong. No one told her not to feel it. She was grateful for that. Rowan said, "Go look at them." She looked up. "The mother and the child," he said. "Go look at them breathing. Your hands did that." She went and looked. She stood in the doorway of the back room for a long time, watching the rise and fall of two chests, mother and infant both asleep now, and she thought about what Rowan had said and let it sit. When she came back, Silas was at the work table with a small wooden case in front of him and a carving tool in his hand. She watched him press her name into the lid, letter by letter, deliberate and careful. He slid it toward her when he was done. "Your instruments should have a proper case," he said. That was all he said. Jonah picked up the infant from the basket, where they'd settled him, and walked over to Nell and placed the baby in her arms. Not carefully, not gingerly, not with that particular softness people use when they're trying to protect you from your own feelings. Just handed him over, like it was the obvious thing to do. She held him. Jonah sat down next to her and looked at the baby too, comfortable with the quiet. "I want to show you something," Nell said eventually. She went to her room and came back with a folded page and spread it on the table. The three brothers gathered around it. She walked them through the notation system Wren used, the columns, the symbols, what each code indicated. Mothers on one side, infants on the other. Transfer locations, marked in a shorthand she'd decoded during the 4 months she'd spent watching things she wasn't supposed to see. Silas had a pencil in his hand within a minute. He started cross-referencing symbols against each other, making marks in the margin, asking Nell questions that told her he was already 3 steps ahead and keeping up without effort. Jonah traced one symbol with his finger. "I know that mark," he said. "That's the stamp used on freight consignments out of the Mercy Gap mines. The abandoned section, not the working one." Rowan straightened up. Nell pointed to the entry near the bottom of the page, the one she'd been looking at since she first decoded it. LM female. Retained, alive, registry service. Location, Mercy Gap. The room was very quiet. Rowan read it again. Then he stepped back from the table and stood with his hands loose at his sides, and Nell watched him absorb it in the careful, contained way of someone who had been hoping for 8 years and was now terrified to believe. "She's alive," Silas said. Not a question. Reading the notation the same way Nell had read it. "That's what this says," Nell told them. Outside, the wind had dropped. The mountains were still. And somewhere below Mercy Gap, in the abandoned tunnels that no one was supposed to be using anymore, Lydia Mercer had been alive long enough for someone to put her in a registry and give her a code. The public notice arrived with the afternoon mail, carried up by a trapper who didn't know what he was delivering. Nell unfolded it. Her own name was at the top. Below it, an official accusation in formal printed type. "Unstable woman. Missing infant. Believed dangerous." Signed by Augustus Wren, M.D. She set it on the table beside the registry page. 2 documents, both with Wren's authority behind them. One was a lie built to chase her. The other was a record he'd kept. Because powerful men always kept records, because they never believed anyone would find them. Nell had found them. She folded both papers and looked at the 3 brothers. "We need to get into those tunnels," she said. Nell found the letters on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside the signal tower's logbook, where Rowan had been using them as a bookmark. She wasn't snooping. She'd gone up to record the previous night's lamp readings, the way Rowan had shown her, and the logbook had been sitting open on the shelf. The letters slipped out when she lifted it. She caught them before they hit the floor. She recognized the seal immediately. Western Matrimonial Registry. Two of them, dated months apart, both addressed to Rowan Mercer, both responses to inquiries he had submitted using his real name. She read them, standing at the tower window, with the morning light coming through the glass. When she came back down, she put the letters on the kitchen table and sat across from Rowan and waited. He looked at them. He didn't pretend not to know what they were. "You contacted the registry," she said. "Yes. Before I ever submitted my application." "Yes, you used your real name." She kept her voice level. "You went looking for information about Lydia, and you used your real name with the same agency that made her disappear." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "I expected them to send a courier, a letter back, maybe someone to warn me off. I wanted to know if they'd react." "They reacted," Nell said. "They sent me." She watched that land, watched him absorb exactly what that meant, that his investigation, conducted without telling anyone, without considering what might happen to an unknown woman on the other end of it, had resulted in her being packaged up and shipped into the mountains with 3 fraudulent contracts and armed men behind her. "I didn't request you specifically," he said. "I know that. It doesn't change what happened to me." The kitchen door opened, and Silas came in from outside, read the situation in about 3 seconds, and sat down. He looked at the letters. He looked at his brother. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. Rowan said a while. Silas turned to Nell. "What do you need from him right now?" "I need him to admit that his secrecy had consequences he didn't account for." Rowan's jaw tightened, but he said it. Plainly, without dressing it up. "My secrecy had consequences I didn't account for. You were one of them. That was wrong." Jonah had appeared in the doorway. He'd heard enough on the way in. He pulled out a chair and sat down and looked at his oldest brother. "Hiding something from someone to protect them," he said, "still means they don't get to choose. That's not protection. That's just a different kind of control." Rowan didn't argue. Nell stood up and went to the window. Outside, the snow was starting to thin at the edges, where the sunlight hit the south-facing slope. Still weeks away from the road opening. Still no way out. "I'm going to leave when the road clears," she said. Silas said, "I'll ride with you as far as the junction. Make sure you get through safely. No argument. No attempt to change her mind." She turned to look at him. "I'm not asking you to stay," he said. "I'm saying you'll have an escort if you go." Jonah said, "I have some savings. For the road." "I don't want your money," Nell said. "I know. It's there if you change your mind." She stood by the window and breathed and tried to work out why their refusal to pressure her made this harder instead of easier. The girl came out of the barn rafters. Nell heard the noise, first a scrape, then a thump, and found her crouched behind the feed bin, small and sharp-eyed, and clutching a heel of bread she'd taken from the supply shelf. 12 years old, maybe 13, dressed in too many layers for the weather she'd clearly been living in. "I'm not going back," the girl said immediately. "Back where?" Nell asked. The girl's eyes moved to Nell's collar, to the buttons on her dress, to her hands, inventorying, the same way people did when they were trying to determine if someone was safe. "You're the one they're looking for," she said. "The woman from the contracts. My name is Nell. What's yours?" A pause. Ruthie Bell." Rowan appeared in the barn door. Ruthie pulled back against the wall. "She found our bread," Nell said to him. "She's been sleeping in the rafters." She looked at Ruth. "How long?" "2 nights. You must be frozen solid." Ruthie's chin came up. "I'm fine." Jonah arrived next, carrying a blanket without being asked by anyone, which meant he'd already sized up the situation from the doorway. He set it on the hay bale nearest to Ruthie, and then stepped back and gave her room. It took Ruthie about 30 seconds to reach for the blanket. She knew the symbol. When Nell showed her the seal from the registry documents, the girl went very still and then nodded. She'd seen it before. She knew what it meant, and the fact that she knew at 12 years old told Nell more than she wanted to think about. "There's a woman named Mara Bell," Ruthie said. "She's the one who lit your signal lantern, the one that was flashing." Silas leaned forward. How do you know that? Because she told me to find this place if anything happened to her. She said the Mercers would be looking for her too. Ruthie picked at a loose thread on the blanket. She's been living underground for a long time, near the Mercy Gap mines. Rowan and Silas looked at each other. Nell watched them work it out. She'd already worked it out. The riders arrived mid-afternoon, coming up the South Trail under a white flag. 4 of them, stopping at the property line, the way men do when they want to talk but don't want to be shot for approaching. Rowan went out to meet them. Nell stood on the porch. The man who spoke had an educated voice and a practiced manner. He said that Dr. Wren was concerned for Nell's well-being. He said that the diagnosis she'd received was not necessarily permanent, that there were treatments available, that a woman in her particular situation might find that returning voluntarily would be in her best interest. Nell stood on the porch and listened to him describe her greatest wound as a bargaining chip, and she felt something go very clear and very cold inside her. He thinks that's what it takes, she said. The fertility, that's his lever. The man smiled. Dr. Wren I heard you, she said. No. The man's expression shifted. The pleasantness didn't leave exactly, but something behind it changed. Lydia Mercer, he said, looking past Nell at Rowan, is alive. Dr. Wren wants you to understand that she will remain so only as long as this investigation is discontinued. The silence on the porch was absolute. Rowan's face didn't move. Nell looked at the man with the educated voice and the white flag, and she thought about Lydia's initials in a registry column. Retained alive, registry service. You can tell Dr. Wren, she said, that I've heard his offer and I've considered it carefully. She went back inside and closed the door. That evening, Silas spread all 3 marriage contracts on the table and took a pair of scissors and cut the signature sections off each one. Clean cuts, deliberate. He set the pieces with Nell's forged name in them in the fireplace and watched them burn. Those were legal documents, Rowan said. They were fraudulent documents, Silas said. There's a difference. He put the scissors down, and we all know what they were really for. He was right. Nell had been turning it over all day, and she'd come to the same conclusion from a different direction. Wren hadn't forged 3 contracts because he wanted 3 men to share a wife. He'd done it because he wanted 3 men to fight over one. Brothers who turned on each other couldn't investigate a criminal network. Men who resented each other couldn't protect anyone. 3 contracts wasn't a love story. It was a demolition plan. He expected you to divide, she said. He miscalculated, Silas said. Jonah had spent the last hour making up a proper bed in the small room off the kitchen for Ruthie. He came back in, looked at the burned scraps in the fireplace, and said, Good. Ruthie appeared in the doorway behind him, wrapped in her blanket, holding the heel of bread she'd apparently refused to give up. She looked at the fireplace, then at the room full of adults who weren't fighting each other. She reached into her coat. Mara, Belle gave me this, she said. This morning, before I came up the mountain, she held out a leather identification band, the same blue material as the one from the signal tower. But this one was stained dark. She said to give it to the Mercer brothers, and they'd understand. Rowan took it. She said to tell you her name, Ruthie said. Her real name, not the one she's been using. She looked at each of them in turn, making sure they were all listening. Mara Belle is Lydia Mercer. Ruthie knew the entrance, the way children know places adults stop paying attention to completely and without uncertainty. She led them up the South Ridge before dawn and along a shelf of rock that would have looked like nothing to anyone who hadn't been told where to look. The ventilation opening was behind a wall of frozen brush, disguised under ice and old timber, wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Silas had the mining maps. He'd gotten them from the county surveyor's office 2 years back. Back when he'd first started piecing together that the old Mercy Gap silver operation was more than simply abandoned. He spread the relevant section on a flat rock and traced the route with his finger while Jonah held the lantern. Main chamber here, Silas said, then 2 branch tunnels running east. The ore tram system would have run through this central shaft. He tapped a point on the map. The infirmary, if there is one, would need ventilation and water access. That puts it here or here. Jonah studied the map. The tram system, if any of the tracks are still intact, that's how they're moving people. Easier than carrying them. Can it be repaired? Nell asked. Depends on what's broken, Jonah said. If it's just the mechanism and not the tracks themselves, yes. Rowan was already at the entrance. Nell stays at the opening until we've confirmed the first passage is clear. Nell goes in with you, Nell said. He turned to look at her. I'm the one who can read whatever records are down there, she said. I'm the one who knows what the medical supplies look like and what's being used to sedate people. You need me inside. A long pause. Stay close, he said. The tunnels were cold, in a way that was different from the mountain cold above, denser. The lantern threw shadows that moved wrong against the curved walls. Nell kept one hand on the rock face and followed Silas's lamp ahead of her. And behind her, she could hear Jonah's steady breathing and Ruthie's lighter footsteps. They'd been underground for maybe 20 minutes when the collapse happened. It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing, just a sound like a breath being let out. And then the section between Nell and Silas on one side and Rowan and Jonah on the other was full of rock, dust, dark. The lantern on Nell's side had gone out. Silas's voice came from 2 feet away, close enough that she almost walked into him. I'm here. Are you hurt? No, you? He didn't answer immediately. Silas. My leg, he said. Something caught it on the way down. I'm standing. It's fine. It was not fine. She could hear it in his voice, the particular flatness of someone who was managing pain by not looking at it directly. She got her hands on him, and he let her, which told her more than words would have. The cut was deep but clean. She used her petticoat and the medical supplies from her bag and worked in the dark by touch, which was not ideal and also completely sufficient. She'd done worse in worse conditions. Talk to me, she said while she worked. It'll help you stay focused. I'm focused. Then talk to me so I stay focused. A pause. What do you want me to say? Anything true. Another pause, longer this time. I don't trust people easily, he said. I haven't since Lydia left. There was a man who came through the pass that summer, said he was a route agent for a freight company. I vouched for him. I let him stay 3 nights. His voice was even, but she could hear something underneath it. He's the one who told Lydia about the registry. Nell tied off the bandage. She didn't offer absolution. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, or that he couldn't have known. He wasn't asking for that. I don't need you to become softer, she said. I need you to be honest. You've been that since the first morning. He was quiet for a moment. I can walk, he said. I know. Let me get my bag first. They moved through the dark passage by feel until they found the side branch that reconnected to the main shaft, and there was light ahead of them, faint and yellowish, and voices. Jonah's first, then Rowan's, tight with relief. Then, underneath both of them, a sound that stopped everyone. A lullaby. Old and simple, the kind a child would know. Coming from somewhere ahead in the dark, Rowan went very still. She used to sing that, he said quietly. When she couldn't sleep, when we were young, they followed it. The underground infirmary was a converted ore processing room. The ceiling reinforced with new timber, the floor laid with salvaged planking. There were cots, a wood stove, medical supply crates along one wall. It was, in the worst possible way, organized. Mara Bell was in the far corner, hunched over a small writing table with a candle. She heard them and stood and reached for something on the table, a weapon, probably. And then Rowan stepped forward into the candlelight and stopped. She looked at him for a long time. Then she sat back down and covered her face with both hands. She was older than the Lydia Mercer in the photograph Nell had seen in the signal tower. Harder. Her hair was the same dark color, but she wore it differently. Pulled back tight, practical. She'd been surviving down here for a long time, and it showed in every line of her. Rowan crossed the room, and she let him put his arms around her. And the sound she made was not the sound of someone who was relieved or happy, but of someone who had been holding something together for 8 years and had just, for the first time, been allowed to put it down for a moment. Silas leaned against the wall and said nothing. Jonah looked at the ceiling. Nell looked at the medicine bottles. She picked one up, read the label, opened it and smelled it, set it down and picked up another. "They're being sedated," she said. "All of them. This compound in high doses causes confusion and memory disruption. That's how he controls them. They don't run because they can barely remember where they are." Lydia pulled back from Rowan. "There are 12 women, 5 newborns. He's planning to move them before the spring thaw opens the roads. Then we need to move faster," Rowan said. "You're coming out with us now tonight." Lydia looked at him. "Lydia." "My name is Mara," she said. Then, softer. "I've been Mara for a long time. I'm still Lydia, too. But I need you to understand that I didn't stay here because I couldn't leave. I stayed because I'm the only person who knows who these women are and where they came from." She met his eyes. "I'm not leaving them." Rowan's jaw worked. Nell could see him assembling the argument, the perfectly reasonable argument about safety and risk, and the fact that she was his sister. He didn't make it. "Tell us what we need," he said instead. Lydia exhaled. "Time, a way to signal the surface, and someone who can manage the medical side once we start getting women out." Nell was already studying the Ortram mechanism at the far end of the room. "Jonah, come look at this." He crossed the room and crouched beside her. She showed him the brake assembly, the counterweight, the basic principle of how the tram had been designed to run. He turned the mechanism over with his hands, checked the tracks, stood up. "Fixable," he said. "Give me an hour and the right tools." The explosion came from the upper shaft, not large controlled, targeted, kind used to seal a passage rather than collapse an entire tunnel. Dust rolled through the room in a wave. When it settled, Lydia said, "He knows you found me." The rockfall was already groaning somewhere above them. Rowan moved first. He put himself between the ceiling and the group and stayed there while smaller debris rained down. And Nell got Lydia moving, and Silas his leg, bleeding through the bandage she'd wrapped, pulled Ruthie under his arm, and kept her upright. Jonah had already found the escape passage. Narrow, low-ceilinged, running east. He'd read it off the map in the time it took everyone else to react. They went through it single file, fast and close together, and came out on the far side of the ridge, into the cold open air, with the mountain at their backs, and Wren's plan to trap them collapsed in the rubble behind them. Standing in the snow, breathing hard, Nell counted heads, everyone out. "He'll move them now," Lydia said. "As soon as he realizes that tunnel is clear, he'll move all of them before we can come back." Nell looked at the mountain and thought about 12 women and 5 newborns being loaded onto wagons in the dark. "Then we go back," she said, "just not through the same door." They smelled the smoke before they saw the light. Nell was the first one off her horse. The barn was fully involved by the time they came around the tree line, orange and roaring against the dark, and Jonah was already running before anyone said a word. Rowan shouted after him. Jonah didn't stop. He went in through the side door and came back out with 2 horses, then went in again, and Nell stood in the yard, counting seconds with her heart in her throat, until he appeared a third time with the last of the animals and collapsed against the fence post, one hand pressed to his shoulder. Rowan got to him first. He pulled Jonah's coat back, and Nell came in behind him to look, and Jonah said, "I'm fine," which was what he always said, and was not currently accurate. The burn ran across his left shoulder, serious enough to blister, not deep enough to threaten the muscle if it was cleaned and dressed properly. Nell told him both of those things plainly so he'd understand what he was dealing with. "It hurts," he said. "I know. It's going to keep hurting for a few days. That's how you'll know it's healing." Silas had gone to the barn with a lantern, checking the perimeter. He came back with a tin scorched but intact. Lamp oil. Not a cooking accident, not an ember from the stove. Someone had carried this here. Rowan stood in the yard, looking at what remained of the structure. The livestock were safe. The horses were safe. But the feed, the freight wagons, the tack, the tools, all of it was gone or too damaged to use. He did the math the same way Nell was doing it, and the answer came out the same. They were ruined. The stagecoach driver's name was Fen Grady, and he had been watching from the upper window when Jonah ran into the burning barn. Silas found this suspicious. Nell found this suspicious. Rowan said nothing and went to find Grady and sat across from him at the kitchen table and asked him a single question. Grady lasted about 40 seconds before he talked. He'd been sending information to Wren's men since the night of the crash. Small things at first, which room Nell slept in, whether she'd shown the brothers any documents. Then larger things. The route they planned to take to Mercy Gap. The ventilation entrance to the tunnels. The fire was a message, not a destruction. Wren wanted them to understand what cooperation cost. Grady slipped out while Rowan was still in the kitchen. By the time Silas went to find him, he was gone, and with him the registry page he'd apparently found in Nell's saddlebag. One page, not the one she'd memorized. But still, Asa Pike arrived that afternoon, like a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided that moment was now or never. He was older, trail-worn, with the particular manner of someone who had done things he was trying to account for. He'd been a courier for the registry. He said so without being asked. He described the routes he'd run, the freight he'd carried. He did not use the word infants, but he didn't have to. Dr. Miriam Hale came with him. Small woman, precise manner, the kind of physician who asked questions before drawing conclusions and expected the same courtesy in return. She treated Jonah's burn with the focus of someone who found the work itself important. Clean, dress, instruct him on care. Done. Then, she asked Nell, with Nell's explicit permission, to tell her what she knew about Wren's original diagnosis. Nell laid it out. The examination, the declaration, the formal letter on official stationery that had ended her engagement and rearranged her entire understanding of her future. Miriam listened without interrupting. The method he used, she said, when Nell finished, was unreliable. Has been known to be unreliable for several years among physicians who actually keep current with their literature. She paused. That diagnosis may have been deliberately false, or it may have been a genuine error made by someone who didn't care enough to be uncertain. Both are possible. Can you tell me which? Nell asked. No, and I won't promise you an outcome I can't guarantee. Miriam looked at her steadily. What I can tell you is that Wren used that diagnosis to control you. He knew it was your wound. He aimed at it. Nell had already understood that, but hearing it, said plainly by someone else, someone medical, with no interest in comforting her, that did something the understanding alone hadn't done. Wren's offer arrived by messenger before supper. The terms were written in Wren's own hand, which Nell recognized from the registry documents. Nell would return voluntarily. The Mercer property would be spared any further interference. Fertility treatment would be provided. The brothers would keep their livelihood and face no further consequences. Rowan read it and set it on the table. You have the right to leave, he said to Nell. That's not nothing he's offering. The road will open in a week, maybe less, Silas said. If you stay only because it saves us, I'll personally put you on the first horse south. We don't need saving at the cost of your freedom. Jonah looked at her from across the table, his shoulder wrapped, his face tired. I want you to stay, he said. I'm telling you that because you deserve honesty, not because I want it to be a weight on you. Nell picked up Wren's letter. She read it once more. She thought about what he'd aimed at the fertility, the property, the brothers' safety, and she thought about how precisely he'd mapped every pressure point without ever meeting her face to face. She put the letter in the fireplace. I'm staying, she said, because defeating him is my choice to make, not because anyone here needs protecting. Rowan spent the following morning dividing legal control of the way station into 3 separate portions, one for each brother, and filing the paperwork with the county clerk by post. Wren couldn't pressure one owner to surrender the property if no single owner existed. Nell spent that time training the brothers and Lydia to manage sedated patients, how to assess responsiveness, how to keep airways clear, how to move someone who couldn't direct their own movement. She taught them the same way her mentor had taught her by doing it, explaining each step as it happened, then making them do it back while she watched. Jonah was a natural. Rowan learned by focusing on the logic of each step. Silas asked questions that improved the process. The wooden crate arrived at dusk. Plain pine, no markings, left at the property line. Jonah opened it. Inside were his stolen tools, every one of them, cleaned and oiled, and returned in perfect condition. Underneath them, a folded message. For every page you keep, one mother will die. Jonah held the note in his good hand for a moment. Then he set it on the workbench and picked up the nearest tool and turned it over in his fingers, checking it, and Nell watched him decide something. He thinks, returning these makes me grateful, Jonah said. He doesn't understand how tools work. You don't own a man because you gave him back what was already his. The argument started at breakfast and moved to the main room by mid-morning and was still going when Nell walked in from the barn and found all three brothers talking over each other. She stood in the doorway and listened for a moment. Rowan believed he should be the one to accompany Nell through the underground approach. He had the most experience with mountain rescues, he knew the terrain, and he could manage the physical demands if conditions deteriorated. Silas argued that Rowan became unreliable when someone he cared about was in danger. He'd watched it happen. He had specific examples. Rowan told Silas that his problem was the opposite, that he held himself so far back from caring about anything that he was useless when it mattered. They were both making good points, and neither of them was listening to the other. Jonah said, "You're both talking about her like she's not standing right there." The room went quiet. Nell stepped inside and closed the door. "I'll decide my own role," she said. "That's not under discussion." She looked at all three of them. "Wren forged 3 contracts because he expected you to fight over me. I want you to look at what you're doing right now and tell me he was wrong." Silence. Rowan looked at the floor. Something moved across his face, recognition, maybe, or the particular discomfort of a man who understood he'd just proven someone else's point. Silas sat down. Jonah crossed his arms, not defensively, just waiting. "There's something else," Rowan said. He looked up. "I have to say it. Nell, I've fallen in love with you. I know the timing is—" "I love you," Silas said to Nell, cutting across whatever qualifier Rowan had been preparing. "Your mind, your courage, the way you refuse to submit to any of it, to any of us." He said it to her directly, not to the room. "I'm not asking you to choose me. I'm telling you the truth because you asked us to be honest." Jonah uncrossed his arms. He looked at Nell for a moment before he spoke. "I love the parts of you that you still think are unworthy of love," he said. "That's what I want you to know." Nell stood in the middle of the room with 3 declarations between her and the door, and she thought about how simple it would be if she could just look at one of them and feel nothing for the others. If love worked the way it was supposed to work in the stories, clean and decisive and convenient. "I can't choose one of you," she said. "I could say it differently, but that's the truth of it, Rowan. You make me feel like the ground under my feet is solid. Silas, you're the first person who saw my capability before my damage." "Jonah," she stopped. "You make me feel whole, not fixed. Whole, not one of them moved." "I'm not turning this into a competition," she said. "That's Wren's design, not mine. Whatever this is between us, it waits until we've gotten those women out and put Wren where he belongs." Rowan said, "What if we survive all of it? What then?" "Then we decide. Together. Freely." She looked at each of them. "If any one of you wants out at that point, the door is open, and I mean that," Jonah said. "I'll only stay in this if all 4 of us freely consent, and no one is treated as less important than the others. Everyone equal, everyone with a voice." "Agreed," Silas said. Rowan nodded. Nell crossed to Rowan and kissed him, brief and certain, and he kept both hands still at his sides because she hadn't told him to move them, and he understood the distinction. When she stepped back, she looked at Silas. "You asked me before," she said. "In the tunnel. I told you I wasn't ready. I remember. I'm ready now." "If you want to ask again," he asked. She said yes. Jonah didn't ask. He just waited, and Nell crossed to him and kissed him herself, and his eyes closed like a man who had expected to wait much longer. Each moment meant something different. Nell didn't try to make them the same. They were an hour into the descent toward Mercy Gap when the shot came from the ridge. Jonah went down. Not badly, she could see him moving, pressing his hand to his side where the bullet had grazed him, but down. Nell turned back, and so did Rowan. And in the 30 seconds they were focused on Jonah, the riders came out of the tree line above them and came down fast. Ruthie screamed. When the dust cleared, the riders were gone, and so were Lydia and Ruthie, taken up toward the Mercy Gap Road at a hard gallop. And from somewhere ahead, in the direction of the freight depot, a newborn was crying. Jonah was already trying to get up. Nell pressed her hand over his and kept it there. She looked at Rowan. She looked at Silas. Then she looked at the road ahead and thought about 12 women and 5 infants and Lydia, who had stayed underground for 8 years rather than abandon them. Something glinted in the ruts of the road, small brass catching, the last of the light. She went to it and picked it up. The key to the 3-flame lantern. Lydia had dropped it on purpose. The only rescue route left ran underground. The bridge was gone by morning. The spring melt had taken it overnight quietly, without drama, the way rivers reclaim things. Nell stood on the bank and looked at the place where the crossing used to be, and understood that the plan they'd built was now useless timber downstream. "I'll go in," she said. Rowan opened his mouth. She looked at him. He closed it. "Wren thinks his offer broke me," she said. "He thinks the fertility treatment is what I want badly enough to surrender for it. If Asa stages a false betrayal and delivers me to the facility, Wren will believe I came apart. He'll be watching me instead of watching his exits." Silas said, "What do you need?" Not whether she was sure, not whether she'd considered the risks, just what she needed. "Time," she said. "The medical supplies inside that facility, and a way to signal you once I know where they're keeping Lydia and Ruthie." Jonah reached into his coat. He produced a small mirror, polished steel, the size of a playing card. Signal mirror, she could aim it through any gap, any ventilation grate, any window crack. "3 flashes," he said. "We'll be watching." Asa Pike was a convincing liar. That was the thing about men who spent years doing work they were ashamed of. They learned to wear whatever face the moment required. He delivered Nell to Wren's men at the Mercy Gap Freight Depot with a story about money owed and patience exhausted. And Nell stood beside him with her hands loose and her face carefully empty while Wren's man looked her over. "Dr. Wren will want to see you immediately," he said. "I know," Nell said. "That's why I came." The facility was deeper than she'd expected. Below the freight depot, below the first sublevel, down a staircase that had been built recently enough that the wood still smelled of fresh cut. The air changed as she descended. Warmer, damper, with a particular stillness of a space that didn't get much movement through it. Wren met her in what he called the examination room. He was smaller than she'd imagined. That happened sometimes with men whose voices occupied so much space in your life you expected the body to match. He had careful hands and a pleasant manner, and he looked at Nell the way a person looks at something they misplaced, and then found exactly where they expected it to be. "Eleanor," he said, "I'm glad you made a sensible decision." She sat where he pointed, and she listened to him explain the treatment he was proposing. And she asked the questions a desperate woman would ask, the ones that were about hope and timing and certainty, and she watched him answer with the smooth fluency of someone who had said these things many times to many women in many rooms, just like this one. She noted every detail. Then Wren showed her to a room and locked the door, and Nell stood in the middle of it and breathed for 30 seconds, and then went to work. Lydia was 3 rooms down. Nell found her through the ventilation gap In the lower wall, she could hear her voice, low and steady, talking to the women around her. Still organizing. Still counting heads. 8 years underground hadn't taken that from her. Ruthie found Nell first. The girl appeared at the ventilation gap from the other side, her face dirty, her eyes sharp. "Mama's here," she whispered. "She's sick, but she's alive." "I know. I'm going to help get everyone out. I need you to carry messages. Can you move through these passages without being seen?" Ruthie looked at her like that was almost too simple a question to answer. Yes. Nell spent the next 2 hours mapping the facility from the inside. She counted women 12, as Lydia had said. 5 infants in a side room, tended by 2 women who were clearer-headed than the others, either because their doses were smaller or because they'd found ways to avoid taking the full amount. She identified the sedative compound on the supply shelf, the same one she'd found before, and she prepared a stimulant from the materials available. Careful and methodical, labeling each dose so Lydia would know the sequence. She explained the compound to Lydia through the ventilation gap. It disrupts memory and orientation at high doses. The women aren't confused because they're weak. They're confused because he's been doing this to them deliberately. The stimulant will help clear it. They'll need water and time, but they can move. How long? 30 minutes after the first dose, maybe less for the ones with smaller builds. Lydia was quiet for a moment. "You came in alone? I had help on the outside. Are they in position?" Nell looked at the ventilation grate on the far wall. The angle was wrong. She couldn't see the signal tower from here. She needed the other passage, the one Ruthie used. She thought about the mirror in her pocket. Then Wren came back. He sat across from her in the examination room, and he spread papers across the table. Her medical records. Private records, the ones she hadn't known he'd kept. He described what he intended to do with them, the public presentation, the accusations, the careful narrative he'd constructed about a barren woman, driven to obsession, stealing infants because she couldn't bear her own. He said it pleasantly. That was the remarkable thing. The way he discussed the destruction of her life with the same tone most people used for weather. Nell felt it move through her. The old humiliation, the one he'd planted in the first place, the one that had been growing in the dark for years. She felt it the same way you feel a bone you broke long ago. Not always, but precisely when the pressure finds exactly the right spot. She thought about Rowan telling her to look at the mother and child breathing in the next room. She thought about Silas carving her name into a wooden case. She thought about Jonah placing a newborn in her arms without a single gram of pity in his face. She stood up. "I need to use the washroom," she told Wren. He let her go because he believed she was broken. That was the thing about men who used wounds as weapons. They forgot that the person carrying the wound had been living with it longer than they had. Nell had been living with this one for years. She knew every hallway of it by now. She went through the passage. Ruthie had shown her and found the ventilation grate that faced east. She angled the mirror through the gap. 3 flashes. Waited. 3 flashes again. From the distant tower, so far away, it was almost imperceptible. 1 flame appeared. 2. Then 3. All 3 brothers. In position. Lydia's voice came from somewhere behind her in the dark. "Tell me when." "Start the first doses now," Nell said. "Give Ruthie the infants as soon as the mothers can hold them. We move in 20 minutes. Wren's men were already gathering the prisoners when Nell came back into the main corridor. She could hear it, the noise of people being moved against their will, the particular shuffle of women who were fighting through sedation to understand what was happening to them. Wren stood at the far end of the passage with 2 of his men, and when he saw Nell, he knew immediately. She could see it cross his face. The pleasant manner dropped like a coat off a hook. "Get her," he said. Nell pulled the loading gate lever on the ore tram housing beside her. The iron gate dropped and blocked the corridor, and she ran. Nell came out into Mercy Gap's public square at the worst possible moment, which was also the only possible moment, because Wren had gotten there first. He was already talking when she emerged from the freight depot's side door. He'd assembled an audience the way he assembled everything, efficiently, with the correct paperwork. The town's justice of the peace was there, a deputy, a cluster of citizens who had come out for the commotion and stayed because Wren was persuasive, and the story he was telling was simple. He had Nell's medical records in his hand. He was explaining her infertility. He was explaining what that kind of loss did to an unstable woman's mind. This woman, he said, and his voice carried well in the cold air, has been taking infants from my care facility. Mothers in her ward have died under her supervision. She has constructed an elaborate fantasy to justify her actions because she cannot accept the truth of her own condition. The crowd was listening. Crowds always listen to confident men with official documents. Nell walked into the center of the square. Wren saw her, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A recalculation. He adjusted and kept going. As you can see, he said, she's returned voluntarily because she understands that the evidence against her is. Read the identification code on the infant you're holding, Nell said. Wren stopped. He was holding a baby, one of the infants from the facility, brought out as a prop in his presentation. He'd made a mistake doing that, but he didn't know it yet. Read the code on the band, Nell said, on its wrist. Read it aloud, so everyone here can hear you. Wren looked at her. The code confirms the registry format you use to track infants through your system, Nell said. If you read it, this entire square will hear you confirm that the child has a registry number, and then I'm going to tell them whose child this is. A long pause. Wren read the code. He read it because refusing would have looked like guilt. And he'd spent 40 years being the kind of man who never looked like anything. Nell recited the mother's name, the date of birth, the transfer notation she'd memorized from the registry page months ago in a cold tower room, with Silas's pencil moving in the margin beside her. From somewhere in the back of the crowd, a woman said, "That's my daughter's birthday." Then Miriam Hale stepped forward. She was not a large woman, and she did not raise her voice. But physicians who've been practicing for 20 years learn that authority doesn't require volume. She challenged Wren's diagnostic method, his qualifications to make the declarations he'd made, and the reliability of the records he was citing, and she did it in the precise, documented language of someone who had prepared for this moment. And then Lydia walked into the square. She came from the freight depot entrance, behind her 12 women and 5 infants, making their way into the daylight, some of them steadier than others, all of them moving forward. Ruthie was at the side door, passing infants out to waiting arms. The women who had gotten their doses early enough were helping the ones who were still clearing. Lydia stopped in the center of the square and said, "My name is Lydia Mercer. I disappeared from Mercer Pass 8 years ago after answering an advertisement placed by the Western Matrimonial Registry." She looked at the justice of the peace. "I have been held in this man's facility ever since." The crowd shifted. That particular shift that happens when a story people believed turns out to have a different story inside it. Wren moved. He grabbed Ruthie from the side door and the infant she was carrying, and he went for the mine entrance at the back of the depot yard, with 2 men flanking him and a satchel over one shoulder. The registry, the remaining records, the evidence. Nell ran. She went through the depot and down the staircase and into the tunnels without stopping to explain herself to anyone, because there was no time, and because she knew this facility better than Wren's men expected her to. She could hear the ORTRAM mechanism grinding ahead of her. Wren had jammed the emergency brake, trying to use the tram to reach the far exit. The tram sat stuck at the edge of the ravine, blocked. Nell reached the control chamber. The brake mechanism was seized tight. She looked at it, and looked at what she had: her medical scissors, wire from the stays in her undergarments, the basic principle of how the mechanism worked, and the understanding that overthinking a problem you have 30 seconds to solve will kill you faster than trying something imperfect. She cut, wrapped, leveraged. The mechanism released. The tram rolled back from the ravine edge and locked against the platform. Stopped just as Rowan came through the upper passage with Ruthie in his arms, Wren's men scrambling behind him. Silas came from the secondary tunnel, and the men had nowhere to go. Jonah's voice came through the ventilation shaft. He'd released the counterweight from the outside platform and locked the tram in place. Wren swung at Rowan with something from the satchel. Rowan staggered. Wren lunged for the mine entrance. Nell pulled the loading gate lever. The iron framework dropped across the exit, and Wren went down under it, pinned at the shoulder and hip, alive and furious and completely unable to move. The registry satchel landed 2 feet from his hand. Nell picked it up. The mothers identified their children in the freight depot yard, while the justice of the peace took statements and the deputy sent riders for the territorial marshal. It took a long time. Some reunions were immediate and loud, and some were quiet, because the women had been sedated long enough that the emotional response came slowly, like circulation returning to a cold limb. Nell stood to the side and watched it happen. Lydia stood with her brothers, all 3 of them together in the afternoon light. She had both names now, the name she was born with and the name she'd survived under, and she wore them the same way she wore the years, without apology. Ruthie found her mother in the last group to emerge. The woman was weak and still somewhat disoriented, but she knew her daughter immediately, and Ruthie walked into her arms with the particular force of a child who had been holding herself together for a long time and had finally been given permission to stop. Rowan, Silas, and Jonah returned the 3 fraudulent marriage contracts to Nell before sunset. All 3 of them together, no ceremony, just the papers placed in her hands. "You're free," Rowan said, completely. None of them asked her to stay. That was the point. That had always been the point. Nell looked at the contracts. She thought about the night she arrived at Mercer Pass, half frozen, terrified, standing in a barn doorway, watching 3 strangers try to save a calf. She thought about what those 3 men had shown her over the months since, not by telling her who she was, but by acting as though they already knew and waiting for her to catch up. She folded the contracts and put them in her coat pocket, and she looked at the 3 of them. "Take me home," she said. That night the fire was going, and the house was quiet, and Nell stood in the main room with all 3 contracts in her hand. She put them in the fireplace and watched them go. Then she turned around. "I will never belong to any of you as property," she said. "I need that to be the first thing stated and the last thing forgotten." She looked at each of them. "I don't want you divided against each other. I love all 3 of you. I'm staying because I choose to, and I will only stay if that choice remains mine to remake every day." She laid out the rest, jealousy spoken rather than buried. "No, primary husband. Every person in this family retaining the right to their own boundaries." All of it said plainly, the same way she stated medical facts not to be cruel, but because precision mattered. Rowan answered first, then Silas, then Jonah. Separately, as she'd asked, so she could hear each of them without the cover of the group. Rowan said, "Are you certain?" Nell crossed to him and looked up and said, "Yes." He leaned close, the same gesture as that first night in the barn, the storm outside, the calf shivering in the straw, and said, "I'll show you how to make babies." Nell felt something in her chest go warm and sharp at the same time. "No man shows me anything," she said quietly, "unless I choose to share it with him." She took Rowan's hand, then Silas's. Then she crossed to Jonah and took his. She led them toward the bedroom. Outside, through the window, the 3-flame lantern burned steadily against the dark. 6 weeks later, Nell was in the pasture with the calf fully weaned now, taller than she expected, still inclined to bump his nose against her palm when she wasn't paying attention when the nausea came. It wasn't subtle. She sat down on the fence rail and waited for it to pass, and it didn't pass. And she sat there in the morning light, thinking about the last time she'd paid close attention to her own body and calculating backward with the particular focus of a woman who had been told her whole life that this calculation didn't apply to her. Miriam Hale was still in Mercy Gap. She came up to Mercer Pass 2 days later and examined Nell with the same careful thoroughness she applied to everything. And she asked when Nell had last had her monthly bleeding. And Nell told her. Miriam looked at her for a moment. "You're pregnant," she said. Nell sat with that for a while. She didn't cry. She didn't feel the rush of joy she'd read about in letters and novels, the kind that arrived clean and uncomplicated. What she felt was fear, old, familiar, deeply personal fear, because she had spent years building a life that didn't include this possibility, and now the possibility was sitting in front of her, and she didn't entirely trust it yet. "Wren's diagnosis," she said, "was unreliable," Miriam said, "as I told you. You may have had a reduced chance of conception." Reduced is not the same as impossible. She paused. "I also want to say clearly that this pregnancy does not determine your value. You were not less before. You are not more now." Nell nodded. She told the brothers that evening. All three of them together, in the kitchen, before supper, because there was no version of this conversation that should happen in stages. Rowan went still, not cold still. The way he went still when something moved him past the point where expression could keep up. His eyes were bright. Silas looked at Nell before he said anything else. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Not about the child. About herself. Frightened," she said, "and something else I don't have a word for yet." Jonah had crossed the room before she finished talking. He stopped in front of her and looked at her, and then he looked down at the space between them, and he waited. He always waited. And Nell reached out and took his hand and placed it there. None of the three brothers asked the question she'd braced for. It was Silas who named the absence of it out loud. "Paternity doesn't matter," he said. "This is our child." "All of us. I don't want it investigated," Nell said. "Not now, not later. Our family doesn't divide by inheritance or biology." All three of them agreed. The legal arrangements took time, but not as much as Nell expected, partly because Silas had a precise mind for documentation, and partly because Asa Pike, in the process of testifying against Wren's network, had identified a territorial judge who owed nobody any favors, and who read the property and guardianship agreements Silas drafted with the thoroughness of someone who intended to sign them. The private commitment ceremony was held in the yard at Mercer Pass on a morning when the light came through clean and the mountains were sharp against the sky. Miriam Hale was there. Lydia was there. Ruthie stood beside her mother, who was steadier every week, and had started helping with the refuge's laundry. The rescued women who remained in the area came, most of them. Nell made a separate promise to each brother. To Rowan, she promised honesty, even when the truth was hard to say and harder to hear. To Silas, she promised respect for his intelligence and the right to his own solitude when he needed it. To Jonah, she promised never to mistake his tenderness for weakness, because she'd seen by now what it actually was. The brothers' promise was collective and deliberate. None of them would own her, and all three would share the responsibility of the family they were building. The refuge opened in the old assay building that summer. Lydia kept the records. Both her names were on the door. Silas mapped the protected escape routes through the mountains, marking the paths that could move a woman on foot in winter, the waypoints that offered shelter, the signal positions along the ridgeline. Jonah built what was needed: beds, cradles, storage shelves, an additional room, when the first one filled up faster than they'd expected. Rowan restored the Mountain Rescue Service, which turned out to serve the refuge more directly than anyone had planned, because women in bad weather and bad shape needed someone who knew how to bring people off a mountain alive. Wren's sentencing came through in late autumn. Life imprisonment, kidnapping, unlawful confinement, document fraud, infant trafficking. The judge read the charges with the same flat efficiency that Wren had once used to destroy Nell's future, and Nell sat in the gallery and found that she felt very little. Not satisfaction, not relief, just the particular quiet of something being finished. Several of the wealthy clients connected to the registry were investigated. Two corrupt officials, resigned before the investigation reached them, which everyone understood to mean the same thing as being caught. Four mothers were reunited with children they'd buried in their minds years ago. Ruthie's mother recovered fully by winter. She became the refuge's first resident, who chose to stay on as staff, which Lydia said made perfect practical sense, and which Ruthie announced with the pride of someone whose idea it had been all along. Nell went into labor during a storm. Of course she did. She'd arrived at Mercer Pass in a blizzard, and apparently her life had decided on a theme. Miriam couldn't make it through the blocked road. Lydia was already in the house. She had attended enough of Nell's training sessions to know the sequence, and she moved through it with the calm of someone who had spent 8 years managing chaos. Rowan stayed at Nell's head. He matched her breathing when hers got away from her. He talked to her not reassurance, not promises, just steady, concrete talk about what was happening and what came next. Information rather than comfort. Nell had taught him that laboring women needed the truth more than they needed soothing. Silas tracked time and temperature, and the things that needed tracking. And when Nell asked him questions, he answered them precisely, which was what she needed from him. Jonah kept the fire and the water and the blankets, and he'd built the cradle himself by hand over the course of 3 weeks. In the evenings after supper, he'd sanded it smooth enough that there wasn't a splinter anywhere. The labor was long. Near the end, when Nell was past the point of managing fear gracefully and had simply decided to be afraid while continuing anyway, the baby came and didn't cry. The room went very still. Then Rowan moved. He did exactly what Nell had taught him in the kitchen of this same house months ago, cleared the airway. Jonah had the warm cloth ready. Silas watched the color and called out what he saw, because observation was his skill. And this was not the moment to be sentimental about roles. The baby cried, strong, aggrieved, fully committed to the noise, the cry of someone who had opinions about the temperature and intended to make them known. Nell laughed. She couldn't help it. She was crying, and she was laughing, and she was exhausted, down to the cellular level. And Lydia placed the baby in her arms, and Nell looked down at her daughter and felt the word for what she'd been unable to name 6 weeks ago. Certain. That was the word. 2 years later, Mercer Pass had become something people knew about before they arrived. Women came from 3 territories over. Some of them had heard it through the registry's former victims, who had built their own quiet network of information. Some of them had been directed there by physicians who'd read the published account of Wren's prosecution. Some of them simply followed the old stagecoach road until they saw the 3-flame lantern above the way station and understood without being told that this was a place where people were received without conditions. The calf Nell had helped deliver on her first night stood at the pasture fence, fully grown, watching the road with the patient attention of an animal that had decided it owned the property. Nell was on the front porch, with her daughter in her lap, going over a set of patient records, when she heard Rowan's horse on the trail. He came back from the mountain rescue, with snow still on his coat, and crossed the yard and came up the porch steps and sat beside her without fanfare. Silas came around the side of the house, with a rolled map under his arm. New routes he'd been charting since the last snowfall changed the condition of the eastern passes. Jonah was pushing a cradle across the yard toward the refuge. A woman had arrived that morning, barely weeks from delivery, and he'd spent the afternoon making sure she had what she needed. Their daughter looked up from Nell's lap. She had a name for each of her 3 fathers, distinct and specific, because she'd developed strong opinions early about the importance of things being correct. She understood, in the way children understand, things that are simply true from the beginning, that all 3 were equally hers. Rowan sat on Nell's left. Silas dropped onto the step on her right. Jonah finished delivering the cradle and came back across the yard and knelt in front of her, which was what he always did when he wanted to look at their daughter at eye level. Above the doorway, the lantern was lit. 3 flames, steady. Nell looked at her daughter, and then at the three men who had not shown her how to be loved, but had simply loved her until she remembered she'd always known how to receive it, and she thought about what she'd said to them once, that Wren had not merely taken her future, but had convinced her she never deserved one. "You didn't show me how to make a child," she said. She wasn't talking to anyone specifically. She was talking to all of them, which was the same as talking to herself. "You showed me how to build a family." Her daughter reached up and patted her face with one small, certain hand. The lantern burned. The story was finished. There's an old saying out west: a person is worth what they can do when everything else has been stripped away. No name, no money, no road home, just what they carry inside them when the storm hits. Nell arrived at Mercer Pass with nothing but a forged contract and a suitcase. She had been told formally, by people who believed they had the authority to define her, that she was barren, that she was a liability, that her future was something other people got to arrange. And she believed it. For a long time, she believed it. That's the part of this story that doesn't get said out loud enough. Being told a lie repeatedly by people in positions of power will make you mistake it for the truth. But here's what the frontier teaches, if you let it. It doesn't care what you were told about yourself. It only cares what you do when the moment arrives. And Nell's moment arrived in a barn in the middle of a blizzard with a calf that wasn't breathing and three strangers who didn't know what she was capable of because she'd almost forgotten herself. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait to be introduced. She saw what needed doing and she did it. That's not heroism. That's something quieter and harder than heroism. That's a person remembering who they are. The deeper lesson this story carries isn't about romance, though there's plenty of it. It isn't even about the West, though the landscape earns every word. It's about what happens when a woman stops accepting the terms other people have written for her life and picks up the pen herself. Nell didn't tear up those contracts in anger. She wrote new ones, carefully in her own hand, and she made three men sign them before breakfast. That matters, because the world will always offer you a contract with someone else's name at the top. The question the story asks quietly, persistently, all the way to the last page is whether you're willing to put yours there instead. And the answer Nell gives us, from the first step she takes through that barn door to the last morning she sits on the porch with her daughter in her lap and three men who chose her as much as she chose them, is this: you don't find the life you deserve by waiting for someone to hand it to you. You walk toward the light even when you don't know what it means. You do the work in front of you. You state your conditions. And you hold on until the shaking stops. That's the West. That's the story. And if any part of it felt like yours, the part about being told you were too much, or not enough, or already decided, then you already know why it had to be told. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or events is entirely coincidental.